1958, rural Sicily, a dirt road in the hills above Corleone. 11:47 p.m. The night is absolute. No street lights, no house lights, just the moon, partially obscured by clouds casting everything in shades of gray and black. The road is packed earth with ruts from wheels and hooves. On both sides, the landscape rises into scrubland and rocky outcrops. This is not a place where accidents happen that can be easily explained. This is a place where bodies are found weeks later, if they are found at all. A vehicle moves slowly, headlights off, relying on moonlight and the driver's knowledge of the terrain. Inside are 6 men. They are not young. This is not their first killing. Their names are not important to this story. What matters is what they carry and why they are here. They carry Berettas and Carcano rifles, heavy weapons for a single target, which suggests either confidence in the necessity or anxiety about the probability of success. They have been given an order. Kill Luciano Leggio. Bring back confirmation. Report to the boss. The order came from Michele Navarra. By this time in his life, Leggio is 33 years old and already a legend in central Sicily. Not a famous legend. Not the kind that appears in newspapers or that makes national news. A legend of a different kind. The kind whispered in bars and in fields. The kind that mothers use to discipline their children. Be careful, or Leggio will come. The kind that makes old men lower their voices and young men careful about where they walk and what they say. 10 years earlier, Leggio had been a sulfur miner and an enforcer for landowners. 5 years earlier, he had been a subordinate in Michele Navarra's organization. Now, he was something else. A threat to the established order. A young man building power he had not been granted permission to accumulate. The 6 assassins in the vehicle know this. They understand what they are here to do is not just a murder, it is a statement. It is the old order reasserting itself against the young wolves trying to claw their way to the top. They wait on the road. Minutes pass. The anticipation becomes its own kind of silence. Then he appears. 1920s, the village of Corleone. Population 4,700. To understand Luciano Leggio, you must first understand Corleone, not the fictional dynasty that will bear its name in literature and film, but the real place. A hilltop village in central Sicily, approximately 45 kilometers south of Palermo, surrounded by mountains and farmland so rocky that cultivation is barely possible. The landscape is harsh. The beauty is severe. The people are harder still. Poverty here is not a temporary condition. It is not something that strikes suddenly and can be recovered from. It is generational, structural, embedded in the economy itself. Peasants work land they do not own for wages that barely qualify as survival. A family might live on bread, onions, and occasional cheese. Meat is a holiday. Education is a luxury most cannot afford. The average life expectancy for a man born in Corleone in 1920 is 54 years. Into this landscape came the mafia. Sicily's mafia did not emerge from outside. It was not imposed by foreign occupation. It grew from the soil itself, from the need for protection in a landscape where the legitimate government is distant and weak, from the opportunity to accumulate wealth through coercion, from the willingness of men to organize themselves into groups that could impose their will on others. Corleone had been a center of mafia activity since the 19th century, particularly after the unification of Italy. The mafia here was not yet the sophisticated criminal enterprise of later decades. It was more primitive: protection rackets, feuds, cattle theft, water rights, and murder. It was men settling scores with guns and knives. It was the application of organized violence to the problems of rural commerce. The mafia boss of Corleone in the early 20th century wielded power more as a feudal lord than as a criminal entrepreneur. He adjudicated disputes between peasants, he enforced contracts, he protected his followers, and destroyed his enemies. The relationship between boss and subordinate was not contractual. It was personal. It was based on loyalty, fear, and the implicit understanding that betrayal would result in death. By the 1920s, when Luciano Leggio was born, the Corleone Mafia had existed for 3 generations. It was institutionalized. It had traditions, it had protocol, it had a way of doing things. Leggio's family was poor even by the standards of Corleone. His father worked land that others owned. His mother took in laundry. There was no money. There was no education. Young Luciano attended school for a few years before being put to work. By age 12, he was a sulfur miner, a job that destroyed the lungs of most men by age 40. The work was dangerous, the pay was minimal, and the future it offered was death in a shaft, or penury in old age. But sulfur mining was also a training ground for a certain kind of man, men accustomed to danger, physical hardship, and the acceptance that their lives had limited value in the eyes of their employers. Leggio was also put to work as an enforcer for local landowners. This meant breaking legs, collecting debts, intimidating peasants, and occasionally killing those who resisted. The pay was better than mining. The work was more irregular. And it was here, in his late teens, that Leggio developed the reputation that would define his life. He was brutal in ways that impressed even people accustomed to brutality. He would break a man's leg for a debt of $10. He would beat a peasant unconscious for taking grain from a field. He did these things without hesitation, without seeming to experience moral difficulty, and without mercy. But more than that, he seemed to enjoy it. Other men did violence because it was their job. Leggio seemed to do it because he was good at it and because it fed something in him, a hunger for dominance, for control, for the acknowledgement that other men feared him. By his late teens, Leggio had accumulated a reputation, not just as someone dangerous, but as someone different, someone who did not seem bound by the normal limits of behavior, someone who would challenge older men, someone who would mock traditions that others obeyed without question. 1940s to 1950s, Corleone and surrounding territories. By the time Luciano Leggio came of age in the 1940s, Corleone had a recognized mafia boss and a clear organizational structure. Michele Navarra, a physician and power broker who represented what the Sicilian Mafia was increasingly becoming by the mid-20th century. Navarra was educated, genuinely educated, not street educated. He had studied medicine. He wore suits that fit properly. He had political connections to local officials and to the Italian government. He represented the mafia's ambition to become respectable, to embed itself so deeply in legitimate society that distinguishing it from legitimate power became impossible. Navarra's rule over Corleone and surrounding territories was strategic and measured. He did not use violence carelessly. When violence was necessary, it was calibrated to send a message without creating the kind of chaos that drew state attention. He had networks of patronage, people he helped, people in his debt, people who owed him favors. Through these networks, he maintained control without needing to use force constantly. By the 1940s, Navarra had ruled Corleone for approximately 20 years. The system worked. It generated wealth. It was stable. It required discipline from those below him, but it offered security to those who adhered to its rules. Then Luciano Leggio began to break the rules. Navarra noticed Leggio because Leggio could not be ignored. The young man was accumulating power and followers, operating with an autonomy that should not have been permitted under Navarra's system. Other young men did not do this. They waited. They proved themselves. They moved up through the hierarchy in orderly fashion. Leggio moved up through the hierarchy by simply taking what he wanted and daring anyone to stop him. This was threatening to Navarra in a way that straightforward criminality was not. Navarra could handle a rival gang, he could handle a police crackdown, but he could not handle the erosion of his authority from within. So Navarra made a calculation. Bring Leggio into the formal structure, make him a made man, or bring him into the close circle of the Corleone organization, and thereby make him subject to the organization's rules and answerable to Navarra's authority. It was a reasonable calculation. It was also wrong. 1948 to 1958. Corleone. Once inside the organization, Leggio did not become more obedient. He became more ambitious. He understood now how the organization worked. He understood where the money came from and how it flowed. He understood the networks of corruption that protected the organization from state interference. And he began building his own crew, not with Navarra's permission, not as a subordinate structure within Navarra's organization, but independently, as a separate power center. These were young men like Leggio himself, poor, ambitious from the rural areas where police presence was minimal and where traditional authority could be challenged. Leggio offered them something the traditional mafia did not: direct action, quick profit, and freedom from the rigid hierarchies that governed the older organization. If you were willing to follow Leggio and willing to be violent, you could accumulate wealth and power quickly. You did not have to wait 20 years to move up the hierarchy. The young men came. By the early 1950s, Leggio had assembled a following that was significant enough to be its own faction within Corleone. He was conducting unauthorized extortions. He was stealing cattle and selling them. He was taking protection money that should have gone to Navarra. He was killing people without permission. He was openly defying Navarra's authority. When Navarra issued warnings, beatings, threats, the seizure of Leggio's gains, Leggio responded by intensifying his activities. The beatings did not intimidate him. The threats did not silence him. The seizures of his wealth made him angry and more determined. The exact nature of the escalating conflict between Navarra and Leggio during the early 1950s varies in historical accounts. Court records and later Mafia Pentiti testimonies from Mafia members who cooperated with the state, describe a deliberate strategic challenge by Leggio. Other accounts describe it more as personal ambition colliding with traditional authority. What is absolutely clear is that the collision was real, intensifying and approaching a point where one man or the other would have to be eliminated. By 1957 to 1958, the situation had become untenable. Navarra could not allow this challenge to continue without losing control of the entire organization. Younger men would see that defying the boss and living was possible, and the hierarchy would collapse. Leggio could not stop now. He had committed himself to a course that only ended in total victory or death. One of them would have to go. Navarra moved first. 1958, rural Sicily, a dirt road in the hills above Corleone. The ambush begins. The 6 assassins do not have to wait long. Leggio appears on the road. Accounts vary on whether he was traveling on horseback, on foot, or by vehicle, and on the precise circumstances that brought him to this location at this particular time. What is documented is that he came to the road, and the assassins were waiting. The gunfire is sudden and total, multiple shots, heavy weapons. This is not an ambush meant to wound or warn. This is an ambush meant to kill. Leggio falls, blood pools beneath him in the dirt and rocks. The assassins approach. the way professional killers do, checking the body, looking for signs of life. The exact number of times Leggio was shot and the severity of his wounds are disputed in court records, but all accounts agree on the basic fact. He was shot multiple times and appeared to be dead. The assassins report back to Corleone. He is dead. And then something happens that changes everything. Hours later, in the darkness of that same night, or perhaps the next night, accounts vary on the exact timeline, Luciano Leggio's body moves, his eyes open, his consciousness against probability, and despite what should have been fatal wounds, begins to reassert itself. He is not dead. He is severely wounded. He is bleeding. He is in pain that defies description. But he is alive and conscious. And he is, for the first time in his life, furious in a way that goes beyond anger into something colder and more absolute. The exact details of what happened next, how he crawled, where he went, how he obtained medical help, who assisted him, are fragmentary in the historical record. What is documented is that he survived. He did not bleed out. He did not die in that ditch. He received medical attention from sources that remain unclear, but that historians have suggested may have included people loyal to him or terrified enough to help him. He healed in hiding, attended by associates whose names are sometimes documented in court records and sometimes not. He moved between safe houses in rural Sicily, constantly on the move, hidden from both the assassins who wanted to finish the job and from police who would have liked to arrest him. When he emerged weeks later, something fundamental had changed. He was supposed to be dead, but he was not. And he had decided that Corleone would burn. Late 1958, Corleone. When word spread that Luciano Leggio was alive, the reaction was not rational calculation. It was panic. In the Sicilian Mafia, as in many criminal organizations, the ability to survive the unsurvivable accrues a kind of supernatural power in the collective imagination. It is not literal belief in magic. It is the understanding that a man who has survived an assassination attempt that was supposed to be fatal has demonstrated something about himself that transcends normal human limitation. He is faster, smarter, tougher, luckier, or possessed of some quality that puts him in a different category than ordinary men. Leggio had already been feared. Now he became something more, a man who could not be killed. The story spread through the villages of central Sicily like a contagion. Leggio had been ambushed. Leggio had been shot multiple times. Leggio had been left in a ditch to die. And Leggio had come back. But he did not come back for reconciliation or negotiation. He came back for war. Leggio's immediate response to his survival, according to historical records and pentiti testimonies, was to organize a hit squad dedicated to systematically eliminating Navarra's loyalists and consolidating his own control. The exact timeline and the number of people killed during this period are disputed in some accounts, but the overall pattern is clear: a violent purge of the old order. Michele Navarra, the man who had ordered Leggio's death, did not live to see 1959. June 2nd, 1958. A country road near Corleone. Broad daylight. The exact details of Michele Navarra's assassination and Leggio's direct involvement remain contested in historical records. Court documents attribute the killing to a team of shooters, and later Mafia pentiti testimonies connect the operation to Leggio's faction. But the precise command structure and Leggio's personal involvement, whether he pulled the trigger, planned the killing in detail, or authorized it through intermediaries, is not definitively established in the public records. What is documented is that Navarra was murdered. shot multiple times on a country road by men who knew who he was and what he represented. The location and manner of his death parallel Leggio's near-death weeks earlier: a road, guns, the application of overwhelming force. The message was crystalline: the old order is finished. Navarra was the symbol of the traditional mafia: educated, political, measured, connected to legitimate power. His death announced that a new phase was beginning. The young wolves had taken down the old lion. Within weeks, Luciano Leggio consolidated control of Corleone. The exact methods he used, whether through systematic purges, negotiations, or a combination of both, vary in historical accounts, but all sources agree that Leggio's authority became absolute and remarkably swift. Rivals were eliminated or fled. The old families who had held power under Navarra were either brought into Leggio's new structure or destroyed. Some were given a choice: join Leggio or die. Most chose to join Leggio. For the first time in his life, at age 33, Luciano Leggio held complete power over a mafia organization. He was no longer a subordinate. He was not a co-leader. He was the boss, the absolute authority, the man whose decision was law. He had survived an assassination that was supposed to be fatal. He had killed the boss who ordered it. He had taken control of the organization through violence and will. The dead man who came back had changed everything. Late 1950s and into the 1960s. Corleone and expanding into Palermo. What Luciano Leggio built after taking over Corleone was unprecedented in Sicilian Mafia history. Not unprecedented in its criminality, but unprecedented in its structure, philosophy, and methodology. Leggio had learned several crucial lessons from Michele Navarra's fate. The first was that power based purely on tradition and political connection was vulnerable. Navarra had been educated, connected, respected by legitimate society, and still he had died on a dirt road. The second lesson was that absolute obedience was easier to maintain through fear and demonstrated violence than through negotiation or tradition. What Leggio created instead of Navarra's bureaucratic structure was power based on absolute obedience, ruthless efficiency, constant expansion, and the visceral fear that disobedience would result in death. He took the young men he had been cultivating as his followers and promoted his most capable lieutenants. Two individuals in particular would reshape Sicilian Mafia history: Salvatore Totò Riina and Bernardo Provenzano. The historical record on these relationships is documented in court files and pentiti testimonies, though interpretations of the power dynamics vary. Riina and Provenzano were undoubtedly Leggio's protégés. They learned violence and strategy under him. They committed murders at his direction. They built their own power bases within the organization under his authority. However, the exact nature of the command structure between Leggio, Riina, and Provenzano during the late 1950s and 1960s, specifically how much autonomy each man had and how much Leggio remained the supreme commander, is a subject of historical debate that continues among scholars and criminologists. Some accounts present Leggio as the supreme, undisputed commander. Others suggest that Riina, in particular, was already developing independent power and agency that went beyond simple subordination. What is not disputed by any serious historical analysis. Under Leggio's leadership, the Corleone organization became increasingly powerful, increasingly violent, and increasingly sophisticated in its criminal operations. Leggio moved systematically to consolidate control over key revenue streams. He took over agricultural cooperatives, organizations that controlled the buying and selling of grain, olive oil, and other agricultural products. These cooperatives were crucial to the rural economy. Control of them gave Leggio leverage over the entire agricultural system. Farmers had to deal with him to sell their crops. Merchants had to deal with him to buy supplies. The cooperative became a mechanism for extracting wealth from the entire rural economy. He extorted landowners with increasing boldness. Under Navarra, extortion had been calibrated, enough to generate significant income without destroying the victim's ability to pay or creating enough resentment to provoke a state response. Leggio was less subtle. He demanded percentages that left landowners impoverished. He collected these percentages ruthlessly. He killed those who resisted. The message was clear. Resistance would not be tolerated. He built alliances with Palermo families, particularly the Greco clan. This was crucial. Corleone was powerful in rural central Sicily, but Palermo was the capital. The Palermo families controlled the city and its wealth. Without their cooperation, or at least their tolerance, Corleone operations would be constantly subject to violent challenge. By cultivating relationships with Palermo bosses, Leggio ensured that his organization could operate without facing a two-front war. The organization's reputation grew with stunning rapidity. Stories circulated through Sicily about the new breed of mafiosi coming out of Corleone. They were younger than the traditional mafia. They were more violent. They were less bound by the codes and protocols that governed the older generation. They killed with less hesitation and less ceremony. They would murder someone for a minor insult or perceived disloyalty. They seemed to have no limit to their violence. In some villages, simply the name Leggio or Corleonesi was sufficient to ensure compliance with demands. People would pay protection money without negotiation. They would cooperate with Leggio's operations without resistance. They would keep silent about Leggio's crimes to police, not from loyalty, but from absolute terror. But Leggio understood something crucial that Navarra had not fully grasped. Raw power without political protection was ultimately vulnerable to the state. A criminal organization could operate with impunity only if the state apparatus, police, judges, politicians, was either controlled or at least neutralized. Historical records document that Leggio sought alliances with politicians and police officials, though the specific details and the extent of these relationships are sometimes unclear in court documents. What is documented is that by the early 1960s, the Corleonesi had become increasingly difficult for authorities to investigate or prosecute effectively. Police raids would occur after Leggio's organization had moved locations. Witnesses would disappear or recant their testimony. Judges would find that the evidence against Corleonesi defendants was insufficient to convict. This pattern suggests systematic corruption or intimidation of the law enforcement and judicial systems, though the exact nature of the corruption and which officials were involved is not always clear in the historical record. 1958 to 1960. Palermo Court. The Italian police did eventually identify Luciano Leggio as a key figure in Michele Navarra's murder. The investigation took time. Navarra's death was not immediately attributed to Leggio, but by 1959, police had assembled evidence and identified witnesses. A criminal prosecution was prepared. This trial became a crucial moment in Leggio's history, not because of what justice was served, but because of what justice was prevented. The prosecutor gathered testimony from individuals who could place Leggio or his associates at the scene. Physical evidence was collected. Witnesses were interviewed. The case appeared to police and prosecutors to be solid. Navarra's murder was relatively recent. Memory was fresh. The crime scene had been investigated. A conviction seemed probable. The exact methods used to influence the trial outcome are only partially documented in contemporaneous court records. Witness intimidation, judicial pressure, and bribery of judges are more clearly established through later pentiti testimonies than through official documentation of the trial itself. What is clear from the trial records is that despite what prosecutors believed to be a strong case, Luciano Leggio was acquitted. The acquittal sent a message that reverberated through Sicily with the force of a physical blow. Leggio could not be touched. The state could investigate. The state could arrest. The state could prosecute. But the state could not convict Leggio Luciano. The justice system, supposedly the guarantor of order and the protector of society, had revealed itself to be porous, vulnerable, open to manipulation and fear. For Leggio, the acquittal was perfect validation of his entire strategy. Power, violence, and the willingness to use both against anyone who threatened him. These things worked. They worked against rivals. They worked against the state. They worked. By 1960, at age 35, Luciano Leggio had accomplished something remarkable. He had survived an assassination that was supposed to be fatal. He had killed the boss who ordered it. He had taken control of a mafia organization. He had consolidated that control through violence and ruthless efficiency. He had created a criminal apparatus that generated wealth through extortion, theft, and protection rackets. And he had demonstrated that the Italian legal system could not convict him, even for a major crime. He was powerful, he was feared, he was becoming legendary. But his ambition was not yet satisfied. 1960s and onward, Sicily and international trafficking networks. The Sicilian Mafia's engagement with international heroin trafficking was a transformation as fundamental as the invention of gunpowder. It changed the nature of the organization, the scale of its operations, the violence it was willing to employ, and the pressure it came under from law enforcement. Before heroin, mafia revenue came from extortion, gambling, theft, loan sharking, and other localized criminal activities. The profits were substantial, but limited by geography and the size of the local economy. A village had only so much money. A province had only so much wealth to extract. Growth was possible, but constrained. Heroin was different. Heroin was a commodity with international demand. Heroin could be grown in Turkey, processed in Sicily, distributed through Europe and America, and generate enormous profits with each transaction. During the 1950s and into the early 1970s, the dominant heroin pipeline was the French Connection, a trafficking route that moved Turkish opium through Marseille into North American markets. However, beginning in the mid-1960s, Sicilian criminal organizations began developing their own heroin production and trafficking networks, working with Turkish suppliers and American mafia families. By the late 1970s, Sicilian families had begun to dominate international heroin trafficking, substantially increasing their wealth and power. Historical records clearly document that the Corleonesi participated in international heroin trafficking during the 1960s and beyond, with connections to American mafia families and trafficking networks running through Europe and Turkey. The specific structure of these operations, which Sicilian families controlled, which routes, and how the profits were distributed are documented in court records and pentiti testimonies. What is less clearly documented in all cases is the exact extent of Leggio's personal involvement in negotiating with international suppliers or determining pricing and quantities. While pentiti testimonies suggest the Corleonesi sought control over supply and distribution, whether Leggio himself personally conducted negotiations with American or Turkish suppliers remains unproven in the historical record. What is documented is that the Corleonesi faction, as an organization, profited heavily from heroin trafficking, with operational details likely handled by intermediaries and other members of the organization. Late 1960s and early 1970s. Sicily. By the late 1960s, Luciano Leggio had become one of the most wanted men in Sicily. Police had evidence of his involvement in multiple murders. The state had warrants for his arrest. His photograph circulated among law enforcement. Remaining in any fixed location had become dangerous, not because any individual police officer or magistrate could threaten him directly, but because the cumulative pressure of law enforcement attention, combined with the internal politics of the mafia and the heroin wars he was waging, was making his position increasingly precarious. To remain in power, Leggio had to disappear. He went into hiding. The exact locations of his hideouts, the methods he used to evade capture, and the precise assistance he received are only partially documented in court records. Fuller details emerge from later pentiti testimonies, but even those testimonies are sometimes contradictory or incomplete. What is clear is that Leggio spent approximately 7 to 10 years moving between safe houses in rural Sicily, constantly on the move, communicating with his organization through intermediaries and trusted associates. He was not completely cut off. Visitors would come to see him. Messages would be conveyed, orders would be issued. But his ability to exercise direct operational control was obviously limited. He could not attend meetings. He could not appear in public. He could not conduct direct negotiations. During this period, historical records indicate that Salvatore Riina began assuming increasingly significant operational control over day-to-day Corleonesi activities. The exact timeline of this transition and the extent of Riina's autonomy are matters of significant historical debate. Some court analyses and scholarly works present the transition as a gradual and consensual delegation of authority by Leggio, who understood that a fugitive leader needed operational commanders on the ground to manage the organization's daily activities and respond to immediate threats. Other interpretations drawn from different pentiti testimonies and different analyses of the same evidence suggest that Riina was already accumulating power and autonomy that went well beyond what Leggio had authorized or even knew about. The relationship between Leggio and Riina during the 1970s, specifically how much autonomy Riina actually exercised and how much Leggio was actually directing operations from his hiding places, is genuinely unresolved in the historical record. This ambiguity is not a failure of historians or investigators. It reflects the reality that the Mafia kept poor records. Many of the people directly involved are now dead. Testimonies from those who survived are sometimes contradictory. The true nature of command and control during this period may simply be unknowable. What is documented is that the Corleonesi organization continued to function. It continued to conduct heroin trafficking. It continued to accumulate wealth and power. It continued to eliminate rivals. What is also documented is that by the early 1970s, while Leggio remained nominally the supreme leader of the organization, the day-to-day power and decision-making increasingly resided with Salvatore Riina and other operational commanders. The historical record here is important. The organization was evolving in ways that may or may not have been entirely within Leggio's control, or even within his knowledge. A leader who is in hiding cannot know everything happening in his organization. Subordinates operating without direct supervision develop their own agendas and their own power bases. By the early 1970s, the Corleonesi was becoming less a personal fiefdom controlled by Leggio and more a complex organization with multiple power centers. all nominally subordinate to Leggio, but increasingly independent in practice. June 20th, 1974. Near Palermo. Morning. After approximately 5 years as a fugitive, from roughly 1969 to 1974, Luciano Leggio was finally arrested. The location was somewhere near Palermo. The exact location is variously reported in different historical sources. The circumstances of the arrest are documented. He was captured without significant resistance. No shootout. No dramatic standoff. No attempt to escape. Simply the end of the road. Police arrived. Leggio surrendered. He was taken into custody. Luciano Leggio was 49 years old. He was transported to prison, where he would spend the remainder of his life. The Carabinieri and Polizia had finally accomplished what assassins, rivals, and the machinery of the state had failed to accomplish. They had removed Luciano Leggio from active operation. But removing him from the streets did not remove him from the Mafia. 1974 to 1993. Italian prisons, Lecce, Ascoli Piceno, and various other facilities. The historical record on Leggio's role while imprisoned is complex, contested, and profoundly important to understanding late 20th century Sicilian Mafia history. Italian court documents establish that Leggio maintained significant influence over the Corleonesi organization, even while incarcerated. The mechanisms of this influence are documented in various investigations and trials. Coded letters that would be smuggled out and circulated through the organization. Visits from trusted associates who could relay messages and receive instructions. Carefully worded communications that could be understood by insiders but would mean nothing to prison officials who might intercept them. Prison visitors would arrive, ostensibly family members or lawyers, but would actually be high-ranking members of the Corleonesi organization. They would sit across from Leggio, separated by glass or across a table under guard supervision. They would speak in coded language. They would listen to what Leggio said and carry his words back to the organization. Letters would be written. These letters would not explicitly order murders or direct criminal operations. That would be too obvious. Instead, they would discuss family matters and express concerns about business and suggest that certain problems needed to be addressed. But the meaning would be clear to those who understood the code. What is less definitively established in the historical record is the extent of Leggio's ongoing influence and control. Did Leggio remain the supreme commander, issuing orders that were followed without question? Or had Salvatore Riina, operating freely on the outside, become the de facto leader by the late 1970s, consulting Leggio when appropriate but increasingly making independent decisions? This question is genuinely unresolved in the historical record, and different scholars and investigators have reached different conclusions based on analysis of the same evidence. Some analyses of Mafia Pentiti testimonies suggest that Riina deferred to Leggio's authority and sought his approval for major decisions. Pentiti, who were close to Riina, for instance, have testified that Riina consulted with Leggio about major operations, suggesting that Leggio's authority remained paramount. Other analyses suggest that by the late 1970s and certainly by the 1980s, Riina was the operational leader, and Leggio's role was more ceremonial or advisory. Some investigators believe that Riina paid lip service to Leggio's authority, but was actually making independent decisions about which families to eliminate and how to wage the wars that were transforming Sicilian Mafia history. The truth likely contains elements of both interpretations. Leggio probably retained symbolic authority and was probably consulted about major decisions, but Riina probably had substantially more autonomous power than he would have had if Leggio had remained free and active. The exact balance between these two poles is unknowable from the evidence available. What is not ambiguous is that major Corleonesi operations during the 1980s occurred while Leggio was imprisoned. These included purges of rival families that had challenged Corleonesi dominance, expansion into Palermo's drug trade through violent means, and the beginning of a campaign against the Italian state. Attacks on judges, prosecutors, and politicians who threatened mafia operations. 1970s to early 1980s. Sicily. The 1970s and early 1980s saw an escalation of mafia violence in Sicily that was historically unprecedented in its scale and brutality. The conflict was multifaceted. The true large-scale factional war for heroin dominance began in the late 1970s and exploded fully in the early 1980s, often referred to as the Second Mafia War. This was distinct from the violence of earlier decades. The conflict was a war between the Corleonesi and other mafia families for control of territory and heroin trafficking. It was a war between the mafia and the Italian state, as law enforcement and the judiciary began to take the mafia seriously as a threat to governance itself. It involved purges and betrayals within the Corleonesi organization itself as power dynamics shifted. The exact dates and specific operations attributable to individual Corleonesi leaders are sometimes difficult to establish with absolute certainty from the historical record. However, the overall pattern is clear. The violence escalated significantly in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The targets expanded to include judges and politicians, and the brutality reached levels that shocked even Sicilian society. One set of murders stands out in historical significance: the killings of judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino in 1992. Judge Giovanni Falcone had emerged as one of Italy's most determined opponents of the mafia. He had investigated mafia operations with a sophistication and thoroughness that most Italian judges had not matched. He had prosecuted mafia cases and secured convictions. He was preparing an even more comprehensive prosecution when he was killed. On May 23, 1992, Falcone was traveling on a highway near Palermo when his armored car was struck by a massive explosion. The bomb had been planted in a culvert beneath the highway. It was triggered as Falcone's vehicle passed. Falcone, his wife, and 3 police officers escorting him were killed instantly. 2 months later, on July 19, 1992, Judge Paolo Borsellino, another prominent anti-mafia magistrate who had worked closely with Falcone, was killed in a car bomb attack outside his mother's house in Palermo. 5 police officers escorting him were also killed. These assassinations demonstrated that the mafia was willing to murder judges, to wage war against the state itself, and to accept the inevitability of massive law enforcement response that such attacks would generate. The historical and legal record establishes that these murders were ordered by mafia leadership and were part of a broader Corleonesi strategy to eliminate figures who threatened the organization's operations. Pentiti testimonies confirm that Salvatore Riina was the primary decision-maker in ordering these murders. By 1992, Leggio had been imprisoned for nearly 18 years. There is no credible historical evidence that Leggio had any operational involvement in ordering or authorizing the Falcone and Borsellino assassinations. The decisions and planning for these murders were made by the active Corleonesi leadership on the outside, primarily Salvatore Riina. 1984 to 1988, Palermo Palace of Justice. The Italian state finally mounted a comprehensive legal assault on the Sicilian Mafia. The Maxi trial, named because it involved the largest number of defendants ever tried together for mafia crimes in Italian history, began with indictments in 1984 and the trial proceedings ran from February 1986 through December 1987, with verdicts announced in January 1988. The trial brought together hundreds of prosecutions, thousands of pieces of evidence, and testimonies from mafia members who had decided to cooperate with the state in exchange for reduced sentences. The trial took place in a specially built bunker-like courtroom in the Palermo Palace of Justice, designed to protect the judges, prosecutors, and witnesses from assassination attempts. Security was extraordinarily tight. The trial lasted months. The volume of evidence presented was staggering. Luciano Leggio was among the defendants tried in absentia from his prison cell hundreds of kilometers away. He could not attend the trial in person. He sat in his cell, learning what was being said about him through lawyers and through other inmates. The evidence presented at the trial, much of it drawn from pentiti testimonies from mafia members who had turned state's evidence, established the historical record that would define subsequent understanding of Leggio's role in mafia history. Witnesses testified that Leggio was the founder of the modern Corleonesi faction. They testified that he had challenged Michele Navarra and transformed the organization from a relatively traditional mafia family into something more violent and more ambitious. They testified to his ruthlessness, his innovations in criminal strategy, his willingness to use violence as a tool of organizational control and expansion. Some testimonies were graphic. They described specific murders Leggio had ordered or personally participated in. They described his methods of maintaining control through fear, through displays of violence, through the elimination of anyone who challenged his authority. Other testimonies were more general, describing the atmosphere of terror that existed in Corleone under Leggio's rule and the expansion of Corleonesi operations under his leadership. The trial lasted months. The evidence accumulated. The picture that emerged was of a criminal organization that had been transformed by one man's ambition and brutality into the dominant force in Sicilian organized crime. Leggio was convicted. He received a life sentence, not a new sentence as he was already serving time, but a formal legal condemnation that codified his role in Sicilian Mafia history. The trial established in law, if not in legend, that Luciano Leggio had been a major criminal actor and a significant architect of modern mafia organization and strategy. 1987 to 1993, Italian prisons. Luciano Leggio spent the final years of his life in prison, a convicted mass murderer and organized crime boss of historic significance. His once vast power reduced to whatever influence he could exert through letters and occasional visits. The organization he had built was entering its final and most violent phase. By the early 1990s, the Corleonese's campaign against the state and against rival families had generated such massive police and judicial response that the organization's collapse was already in motion, even if those running it could not see it clearly. Salvatore Riina, the young man Leggio had groomed to be a leader, had become increasingly exposed by his own violent activities. His movements were being tracked. His communications were being monitored. The state, pushed by the murders of Judges Falcone and Borsellino, had decided that the mafia had to be crushed, not merely contained. On January 15, 1993, Salvatore Riina was arrested. The man who had been the operational leader of the Corleonesi for years, the young protege who had learned violence under Leggio's mentorship, was captured and taken into custody. Bernardo Provenzano, the other young man Leggio had mentored, remained free, but his operational capacity was increasingly limited. He was in hiding, constantly moving, unable to manage the organization effectively. The Corleonesi was collapsing. On November 20th, 1993, Luciano Leggio died in prison. He was 68 years old, the same year that Salvatore Riina was arrested, the same year that the phase of Sicilian Mafia history that Leggio had initiated, the phase of systematic violence, organizational ruthlessness, and warfare against the state, began its final collapse. Leggio died in his cell, attended by prison medical staff, his vast criminal empire already in ruins, his most powerful followers in custody or in hiding. The man who had survived an assassination attempt decades earlier, who had crawled out of a ditch and rebuilt his life and his power, who had transformed a regional mafia organization into the dominant force in Sicily. That man ended his life in a prison cell, removed from the world he had conquered, watched over by the state he had defied. To understand why Luciano Leggio matters in the history of organized crime, you must understand what he changed in the Sicilian Mafia. When Michele Navarra ruled Corleone in the 1940s and 1950s, the Sicilian Mafia was embedded in a rural economy of protection rackets, cattle theft, feudal-style domination of peasants, and local political influence. Violence existed, but it was often constrained by protocols, traditions, and the need to maintain at least a veneer of respectability. The boss was simultaneously a criminal leader and a social authority figure. He adjudicated disputes. He helped people who were in his debt. He maintained order in a landscape where the legitimate state was distant and weak. Luciano Leggio did not invent mafia violence. Sicily had produced violent men long before Leggio was born. But Leggio normalized violence in a new way. He demonstrated that systematic, unlimited violence could be more efficient than negotiation or protocol. He showed that power could be built and maintained by young men willing to break old rules and challenge established authority. He proved that the state's law enforcement and judicial systems could be overcome through a combination of corruption, intimidation, and strategic violence. The organization he built served as the template for the mafia's next phase: more violent, more ruthless, more willing to confront the state directly rather than merely corrupting it. The mentors he cultivated, Salvatore Riina and Bernardo Provenzano, would take the model he created and extend it to its ultimate expression. By the 1980s, when the Corleonesi had achieved supreme power in Sicily, they were executing judges, bombing civilians, waging a low-scale war against the Italian state. This was the logical endpoint of the model that Leggio had pioneered: power based on violence, organization based on ruthless elimination of internal dissent, expansion based on the willingness to kill anyone who stood in the way. Leggio was not unique in this regard. History is full of violent men who have risen to power through brutality. What distinguished Leggio was his success in building an organizational structure that outlasted him, that continued operating according to principles he had established even after he was imprisoned, and that shaped the course of Sicilian society for decades. Return for a moment to that night in 1958 when 6 assassins shot Luciano Leggio and left him in a ditch to die. If the assassins had taken an additional precaution, if someone had put a second bullet in his head to be certain, if the shot pattern had been slightly different, if blood loss had been a little bit faster, if the wounds had been in slightly different locations, if Leggio had died that night, Sicilian Mafia history would have been categorically different. Michele Navarra might have retained power in Corleone. The organization might have continued operating according to established patterns. The younger men who were beginning to challenge tradition might have been suppressed, and the Mafia might have maintained the relatively conservative structure it had maintained for decades. The heroin trafficking that emerged in the 1960s and transformed the Mafia might have been controlled by different families. run on different principles. The violence that culminated in the murder of judges and the bombing of civilians might never have taken that particular form. The Corleonesi might never have become the organization that dominated Sicily from the 1970s through the 1990s. Salvatore Riina might never have had the opportunity to become the man he became. Bernardo Provenzano might have remained a minor criminal figure. The entire trajectory of modern Sicilian organized crime might have been different. But he did not die. A man walked out of a ditch and decided that the old world would end. Luciano Leggio's historical significance lies not in his uniqueness. Sicily has produced many violent men, but in his refusal to accept the limits of his position. He was born into poverty and recruited into a criminal organization as a subordinate. By any rational calculation, he should have remained subordinate, worked within the structure, and perhaps accumulated modest wealth and some local power. Instead, he decided to take everything. The ambush was supposed to end that decision. It didn't. And from that failure of execution came decades of consequences that reshaped Sicilian society, transformed the mafia into something more ruthless and more violent, and ultimately contributed to the conditions that forced the Italian state to finally take organized crime seriously as a threat to governance itself. It is important to note, as we approach the conclusion, that the historical record on Luciano Leggio contains ambiguities that cannot be fully resolved through archival research or interview. The exact circumstances of various murders attributed to him, his direct personal involvement in specific operations, the precise nature of his relationship with Riina and Provenzano at different points in time. These matters are sometimes contested in the historical documentation. Court records, pentiti testimonies, and investigative reports do not always align perfectly. Different scholars have interpreted the same evidence differently. What is not ambiguous is that Leggio was a major figure in Sicilian Mafia history, that he fundamentally changed the organization he led, and that the violence that followed flowed from principles and strategies he pioneered, or at minimum accelerated. But the specific details of how he exercised power, exactly who did what when, the precise command structure at different phases of his career, these remain in some respects contested territory. The Mafia kept poor records. Many of the people directly involved are dead. Testimonies from those who survived are sometimes contradictory. Pentiti, who have incentives to blame certain people and exonerate others, sometimes contradict each other's accounts of the same events. History, when examined closely and honestly, often proves messier than the narratives we construct around it. Luciano Leggio lived in this messiness. His life was not a clean narrative of rise and fall. It was a complex, contested, violent accumulation of power and influence, followed by imprisonment and decline. The historical record on his life contains gaps. Some things about him will never be fully known. The rise of Luciano Leggio and the Corleonesi faction had consequences that extended far beyond organized crime. The violence that erupted in Sicily during the 1970s and 1980s terrified the civilian population. Grocery store owners were killed for refusing to pay protection money. Entire families were murdered in their homes. Judges and prosecutors were assassinated. Bystanders were killed in car bombings. The civilian response over time was to reject the mafia. People who had lived with the mafia for generations, who had accommodated it, or worked alongside it, or simply ignored it, began to organize against it. Anti-mafia movements emerged. Civil society organizations developed. Schools began teaching children to reject mafia values. The state response, pushed by the murders of Judges Falcone and Borsellino, and the massive civilian demand for action, was to finally commit serious resources to combating organized crime. Law enforcement was reformed. The judiciary was strengthened. Witness protection programs were improved. International cooperation against drug trafficking increased. The Corleonesi, by pushing the mafia's violence to its logical extreme, ultimately destroyed the conditions that had allowed the mafia to survive and flourish. The organization had become too threatening, too violent, too willing to murder judges and bomb civilians. The state could no longer tolerate it. Paradoxically, the organization that Leggio had built to consolidate and expand mafia power, the organization based on unlimited violence and ruthless elimination of all opposition, was the organization that provoked the state response that finally began to cripple the mafia's power in Sicily. November 20th, 1993, a prison in northern Italy. An ordinary day. The man who had been found dead in a ditch 35 years earlier, the man who had come back to take everything, finally died for real. Not from an assassin's bullet, not from a rival's vendetta, not from the violence that had defined his life, from the ordinary causes that eventually claim all men: age, illness, the accumulation of years, the failure of a body worn out by stress and trauma. He died in prison serving a life sentence, his vast criminal empire already in the process of collapse. The young protégés he had cultivated were in prison too. Salvatore Riina arrested that same year, or hunted by the state, like animals. The organization he had built and shaped had been penetrated by informants, dismantled by investigators, and confronted by a state that had finally decided it would not tolerate the mafia's challenge to its authority. In death, Luciano Leggio became less important than the legacy he left behind. That legacy was encoded in the two men he had groomed: Salvatore Riina, who would take the Corleonesi machine and drive it to war against the Italian state until his arrest, and Bernardo Provenzano, whose decades of freedom after Riina's capture would extend the organization's reign, even as its power waned and eventually collapsed. It was encoded in the ruthless organizational principles he had established, that obedience was absolute and enforced through violence, that the organization's interests superseded all other loyalties, including family, that violence was not a tool of last resort but of first resort, that enemies, whether rival mafiosi or state officials, had to be eliminated, not negotiated with. It was encoded in the model of power he had demonstrated, that a young man willing to break the old rules, willing to use violence without limit, and capable of surviving the violent response could reshape an entire organization and rise to supreme power. The ambush on that rural road in 1958 was meant to prevent all of this. The 6 assassins were supposed to solve the problem of Luciano Leggio by eliminating him permanently. They failed. He came back, and he took over. The consequence was decades of violence, corruption, and criminal power that would require nothing less than a complete reformation of Italian law enforcement, the judiciary, and civil society to ultimately overcome. A man shot and left for dead became the architect of the bloodiest phase in Sicilian Mafia history. His principles of organization and violence spread through the Mafia and shaped its trajectory into the modern era. One man's refusal to die changed the course of organized crime in Sicily. One man's decision to take everything transformed the nature of power in a region. One man's legacy of violence and ruthlessness defined an era. History turns sometimes on the failure of a single bullet to do its job. This is the story of what happened when it missed. This is the story of Luciano Leggio, the dead man who came back and took over the Mafia.